I have a list of like all of the holidays, monthly celebrations that the United States has on the calendar, which I'm not even sure if we technically celebrate those in this presidency. But regardless, I have all of the heritage months, and May was coming up, and May is two different things. It's Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and it's Jewish American Heritage Month. I wasn't sure how I was going to reconcile the two because those twains don't seem to actually meet naturally. But I said I'm going to read books that fall under these categories and figure it out later, because I wanted to get a second video up that was a book haul from an Asian American bookstore. I can't do 3 videos in 1 month, guys. Like, just getting this one done was difficult. And I'm running out of lights. So we're going to speed through it. So after starting to read them, I came to the realization I have read way too many World War II books from the perspective of the atrocities that happened in the camps versus the socio-political atmosphere in the different countries. So I realized some things. I could actually do a video of those 2 heritage months because the stories that I read had way more in common than I presupposed, and also than I feel like anybody would presuppose. Most Bookish, Amanda from Most Bookish. Hi, book friends. I'm Amanda. This is Most Bookish. We talk about book things, and whichever of the book things that happen to be percolating in my brain that month is what we talk about. So you're saying, Amanda, what did you read that was so similar for these 2 heritage months? The first book that I read was Real Americans by Rachel Khong. This book is a history of a quote-unquote real American family, and it runs a span of 3 generations. It starts with the daughter, who is a first-generation Chinese American, and the grandson follows, who's second generation mixed Chinese American, and then the end of the story closes out with the grandmother's narrative, which is a story of how she got from China to the Americas. The grandparents that come over are 2 scientists in China that come over during Mao's Great Leap Forward, which is a period of time in China's history where there was a kind of eschewing of Western capitalism. It was a return to communalism. There was a lot of asking people, or at least according to the narrative of this book, there was a lot of asking of people who had very little to give up the very little that they had as a sort of symbol of their turning away from capitalistic, kind of corrupting Western attitudes. So you had things like bonfires where people would throw metal pots into the fire to aid the government, but also as a I can do without gesture. And again, this is people who had almost nothing. So it plunges the country into practical or literal starvation in some aspects. As the people of the country struggle more and more, government, instead of taking responsibility for the situation they've created, they empower these upset, starving, suffering people to root out even more quote unquote corruption, more capitalistic Western corruption. And these especially young groups of people start falling upon the groups of people who have more than them. Even if it's only slightly more than them, sometimes it's a lot more than them. But it turns into this kind of neighbors versus neighbors, denouncing each other, this fever that sees people harmed, sees people killed. And it's all this grand distraction, this grand insanity that really the government of the time was responsible for. And fomenting these feelings is their effort to distract people from that fact. That's what led the family to come over here to begin with. But then they settle, they're here for years, they have a family here. And like I said, their daughter is American. She's born here. But there is this kind of duality in her experience as a Chinese American, trying to be within the American system versus a Chinese American with Chinese parents. There's a push and pull between who she's trying to be in the world and who her parents would have liked her to be. There is an age-old attempt by her parents, or by her mother specifically, to embed certain things within her to help her avoid the difficulties that her mom went through. And as often is the case with parents doing things like that, the results usually are negative, or I suppose what unfurls is negative. And really, it's just a story about a family. I feel like that's the central conflict of the story, that this is a family story from whatever their beginnings were, from wherever they were at to where they are now. And they are real Americans. They are who decides what's real. What does that even mean? The Americans that are encountered, the real Americans, you could say the European Americans that are encountered in the story, have no idea what the hell they're doing either. They are having the same familial issues. They're disconnected from what they're quote unquote supposed to be, or what the expectation of them is, and what their outward appearance would lead you to believe about them is never what they're struggling with interiorly. I like this particular story because it's such a good portrait of that family relationship, of how we struggle to get everything we need from our family when we're young, and then we struggle against everything they need from us as we grow. And there's this misunderstanding of the whys when we're young, and an understanding or an empathy that maybe appears later, but it's fighting with this conflict of reconciling all the things that have happened in between. It's just a really good portrait of a family, an American family. I gave it 3.5 pandas just because there's a little bit of kind of a thriller-esque environment created where you're wondering what the reveal is, like what really happened in the past. Because like I said, it starts with the daughter's story, and there are some unresolved questions that are there at the end of her area once it jumps into her son's story. And then you're like, but wait, you didn't tell me what the actual truth was, and now you're moving forward, and I need to know the things. And so then they finally go backward into the grandma, and that's when you find out the things. The things that I find out, or that I found out, I don't feel like merited a whole book. I am happy that I read it to the end because of the history of the family, more than this mysterious question being answered. I don't think that answer ended up mattering. And maybe that was the point. I don't feel like it was. I think it was just a little bit anticlimactic. However, there were a lot of things that felt like, oh my goodness. Throughout the story, that wasn't this one central question, she revealed very quickly. Like, this was not an author who spent time, after there's a scene where you found out somebody lied to somebody. It's not where she drags out the other person finding out about the lie through the entire story, the way a lot of thrillers do, and that drives me crazy. And it's part of why I don't like thrillers, because all of the kind of guessing about the who's and the what's distracts me while I'm reading. It's kind of like a thriller for impatient people, because she tells you very quickly, like 2 pages later, you're like, oh, he found out it's a lie. And then you keep going to the next one. She does this multiple times. And so it's kind of satisfying that you find these things out quickly. But again, the one central thing that she doesn't tell you to the end, it's like, it doesn't make sense. Like, why did this happen? The justification, it doesn't make sense. Like, it's kind of, let me see, how do I say this without saying it? There's a rift that happens between the mom and the daughter because of something that happened in the past that the mother did. And the daughter never knew about it till she was an adult. And you find out at the end the kind of story of it and the why, and there was no real pressing need for the mother to have done any of it. And so you're kind of confused about why she took that kind of risk, why she did this thing that made no sense, and it affected her entire relationship with her daughter. So I'm going to leave that there. If you want to know what it is, you got to read the book. It is Our Missing Hearts by Celeste Ng. Now, Let me preface this by saying I love Celeste Ng and I think she's a wonderful author. This is the third one of her books that I've read. She has written, if you recognize her name, Little Fires Everywhere and Everything I Never Told You. Little Fires Everywhere specifically is very popular, or was very popular, and I believe they made a TV show out of it. I have not seen the TV show though. But both of those stories are very centered around the relationships of the people in the stories. She writes relationships between people and the tension that can arise over long-term relationships really, really well. It's, in my opinion, what she does best. This is a little bit of a departure for her in that it's not set in quote unquote reality, it's dystopian. There has been an economic downturn in the United States, and this has resulted in widespread job loss, suffering, a kind of hard economic situation that hadn't been seen in the United States maybe since the War of Independence. Like, people were losing things and living multiple people in a house, not having any kind of work. It was kind of dangerous to be outside because of the amount of people who were jobless and the things that can happen to you. Not to the degree of like a post-apocalyptic type situation, but just a general, people were desperate. The backlash of these sentiments as the government is not taking responsibility for the situation that it's created, we're starting to see the relationship between these books, right? It turns out all these books have some kind of relationship. You're seeing another government, the same way we saw a Chinese government back in Real Americans. You're seeing another government have a really difficult situation that they probably contributed to, or that they contributed to by mismanaging. And instead of them taking responsibility for their part in the current status quo, there's a blaming of the other. This book came out in 2022. I feel like the choice to blame the economic downturn on the other by this dystopic American society is related to what we were seeing during and around COVID, where there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment because of all of the rumors that COVID had originated in China. There were conspiracy theories all over the place about whether it was on purpose and what was the real reason. And was this a kind of covert attack from the Chinese? There were all kinds of things flying around back then. And that resulted in real violence toward Chinese Americans or Chinese immigrants that were in the United States. I don't know if that was the case in other countries, but I definitely know that there were reports of it here. And so I feel like this was born from that time period. However, she doesn't base it in a pandemic. She doesn't base it in anything health related or in the actual real circumstances that happened during that time. She bases it in the portion of the story that came from the economic side of the suffering, and how this narrative of Chinese manufacturing and Chinese commerce taking over the world, the fact that we owe China so much money, so many people owe China so much money, and that they're positioning themselves monetarily to eventually be a superpower and possibly take over the United States one day. In the book, people are saying, oh, this economic situation was a play by China. This happened because of the Chinese, because they're trying to harm us. They're trying to destroy our society. And this was all some nefarious scheme. Now, there's a lot about economics in the real world that involves China and America. And ironically, I've had this book for a little while and I didn't read it till now. And the situation with the tariffs in China and that whole conversation is really in the news right now, and what it means. And you have economists explaining Chinese manufacturing and American manufacturing and the history of what's developed over the last however many years since the end of the Second World War. And it's not in the book because this was obviously written years ago, but it's so interesting how often authors see what's happening in the world and can picture the end or the journey of those things in their present to a possible future that looks like a future that we're living through. Same way Parable of the Sower was huge at the beginning of the year. I think it was this year, where people were saying like all of these things that she wrote about are happening. So the hyper-nationalism in the story lives far beyond the recuperation of the economy inside of the story. And it turns into this kind of patriotic system that has neighbors policing neighbors and informing on their neighbors for quote unquote unpatriotic behavior. And as a result of that, there are families that have their children removed, which is something that has happened in the history of this country, as has happened in other countries, as you saw with the Chinese government and Real Americans. And the point is that, or the point that I'm making, is that these stories echo one another. There is no better than, there is no this could never happen here, because it has happened here. And this is a dystopic future, but it's based off of things that have happened in the past. We've done it to Native Americans, we've done it to poor Americans, and we've done it to immigrants. And the justifications have changed, and it hasn't been on a crazy large scale that would bring a type of censor that maybe you see in this book, or maybe that you even saw in Parable of the Sower, because there is child removal in that story too, interestingly enough. And I think it keeps showing up because it's a powerful weapon, as you've seen for the people who've used it historically. But the point is that they're not just like isolated individual people who are bad actors, and there's not this quote unquote evil that comes in and causes this havoc. It is negative sentiment fomented against something that gets directed to a group that's weaker for more powerful groups to escape the consequences. And in a lot of these situations, the more powerful groups are the governments. There are violent acts that are happening by individual people in the land, but they are sanctioned almost by these governments. And the reason that I liked it is because even though it feels of its time, like even though they don't name COVID, there's a lot of centralization on New York. There is a lot of, like, you feel like it has to do with COVID. You can feel the kind of undertones of COVID in there, even though it feels of its time. So it doesn't feel as immediate as maybe it would have if I had read it when it was released. It still feels of this time because of those topics that are still relevant, that came back up in this way that I think nobody expected. But it's a conversation that was kind of always under the waters, and now it's in the open. And this is a good book to read to understand some of that historical negative anti-Chinese sentiment. If you are kind of like tired of all of the news pundits talking about all of this stuff, even though it's not about this particular situation, it addresses a lot of the topics that are happening today. Now, I gave this one 3.3 pandas. The main reason for that is, and I feel like this is kind of what happened in the last one, where the whole book was really a well-written book, but they fumbled the bag at the end. Again, when I told you, Celeste Ng is amazing at relationships, and they do really well with the mother and son relationship, which is the central one in this story. However, at the very end, the mother's relationship with the community that's been impacted during this time, and she has a really complicated involvement with these people. It feels really surface level. Like the way it closes out, what it led to was not what I expected. And it just didn't feel satisfying. The end didn't feel satisfying. I wish it had gone somewhere else. And maybe that's just personal, which all reviews are personal. But overall, in the sense of like writing and the majority of the story, Celeste Ng is herself, and she did a great job like always. Now last you say to me, but Amanda, what does Anne Frank have to do with it? What does Anne Frank have to do with it, Amanda? I thought nothing, but turns out I'm a damn liar. So this story is called The Betrayal of Anne Frank, a Cold Case Investigation. It is by Rosemary Sullivan. If you don't know who Anne Frank is, that is wild, because I feel like every child in a school has been assigned at some point in time the Diary of Anne Frank, which is a real diary that Anne Frank, who was a Jewish girl during World War II, was writing while she was hiding with her family and some other people inside of an annex during the Nazi occupation of Amsterdam. The book itself is a classic and it's a heartbreaking story, not because of what she suffered, because there was so much suffering during World War II. It's more about the fact that her diary is written by her as a young girl. She's a teenage girl when she's in the annex, with this kind of hope, with this love for humanity, with all of a young girl's longing and dreams. And the whole time you're reading it, you know that she died in the concentration camps. And so it's literally heartbreaking. They were in there for, I think, 2 years. You're just watching this whole difficult journey. Or it's not so much difficult, it's hard for her, but it's difficult to watch even the small moments of joy, because you know what the end is. And actually everybody in the annex dies except for her father. So there was the mother, the father, the 2 sisters. Anne was one of the sisters. There was another couple and their son. And I believe there was one more adult man. And all of them perished in the Nazi camps when they were discovered, after they were discovered, which was also heartbreaking because the camps were liberated only months after they were taken to the camps when they were discovered. And if it had just, if they had just made it 6 months more, then they would have made it. What this book is some researchers decided that they wanted to figure out who was it that told about the location where Anne Frank and her family were at to the police for them to have done the raid in the first place. Now, I found that before I started reading the book, surprising, because I always had this idea of it's the Nazis, right? Like, it's the Nazis who found them. It's the Nazis who are the bad guy. Like, what are you going to do about that? And even though I've known about the Nuremberg trials, and I've known that there were a lot of people who went to prison or who were put to death for the crimes that they committed during World War II, I did not realize that individual countries were digging into the individual cases of people who colluded with the Nazis or who reported on Jews or who basically committed crimes during that time against the citizens of that country. I did not realize that they were looking for the people who had told on the Franks contemporarily during those years, and they were never able to find them. So I guess I didn't even realize it was a cold case. The stated reason for wanting to do this now was these people looking around at the world and the reawakening of nationalism that they were seeing throughout different countries. And here is where we realize the story of Anne Frank is related to these other Chinese immigrant stories in the United States. The story of Anne Frank from the 1940s in the Netherlands is related to these American immigrant stories today. But how? You ask. But how? I'm going to tell you. The how is that Anne and her family were not originally from Amsterdam, which is another thing I didn't know. The thing that I liked about this story or this book is that it tells the history of each of the members inside of the annex from the beginning. It tells the story of all the possible people around them that could have been the informant, including the people who were helping hide them. And in telling those stories, it reveals to you the atmosphere and the situation in the Netherlands leading up to the Nazi occupation and then during and after the Nazi occupation. And while I'm sure this is a story that has been told probably in many books for individual countries, I don't feel like it's a narrative that's openly talked about when it comes to World War II. Most of it, especially around fiction, most of the fiction that I've been exposed to is really more from the perspective of the atrocities that the people lived through inside of the camps and at the hands of the Nazis. It doesn't talk about the socio-political structure that exists or that existed in these individual countries that allowed for some of these things to have happened more easily than it should have been. Instead, kind of presented as like, oh, the Nazis have arrived and they kind of swept in and overtook these countries because their only weakness was that they didn't have an army strong enough to repel them. There weren't kind of deeper issues going on within the society and within the government. Or that was my assumption, or it's just something that's not been talked about. This story gets into how various Jews had fled Germany and had fled other countries during the years of Hitler's reign because of the persecution that they were hearing about. Even though they were trying to hide it, even though the Nazis were trying to hide it, there were still talks of the camps. You would have to send your children, again, abducting the children, you'd have to send your children to work camp, and none of the kids were ever coming back. So the Jewish community especially knew what was going on, and those who could get out were getting out. This was to many different countries in Europe, and then some people were getting to the Americas. And inside of these countries, this was creating an anti-immigrant sentiment. Does that sound familiar? It was creating an anti-immigrant sentiment. And the Netherlands was ripe for this because prior to this time period, they were very open to the Jewish community, and they were known to let them practice their religion freely, and there would be no harm, and people weren't persecuting them. They were a very liberal-minded country. And so that was a country that a lot of Jews went to. And it created an overflow of people that they started pushing into particular communities, and that the government started taking steps to regulate because of the negative sentiments that everybody was having towards this population of immigrants. Now, does that mean that they kind of set the stage for Hitler to come and do what he did? No. I'm just saying that all of these things together were contributors to the bad feelings once Hitler did get there that would allow the neighbors to again inform on and turn against these people who were innocent, who just had nowhere to go. There were Dutch people who would inform on you just to avoid paying a fine. And this is historically accurate. It's heartbreaking. It's horrifying. So there were a lot of people that could have informed on them. What I liked about the story was, I think, what the whole intent behind this endeavor was, which is to reveal the conditions in which something like this could happen, and to acknowledge that these conditions can exist and do exist and have existed everywhere. There's no Austin Powers, Dr. Evil, who needs to show up every 100 years to make these horrors happen. There are Dr. Evils all over the place. And if you have the right mixture of a situation, it could breed that horrific world. A horrific world in which an innocent young person, just like Anne Frank, just like the people in my other two fiction books. This one is nonfiction and those two are fiction. But just like the people historically in China and the Chinese Americans here have faced at different times in history, that these young, innocent people have paid the price for things completely out of their control, and our tendency as human beings to want to blame groups that we can influence. I feel like it's almost that we believe that governments and people in power are too big for us to affect. And we can't take our frustration with what is happening out on those people, and they know it. And so they very easily turn our attention to people who are much closer to us that we can take those frustrations out on. And unfortunately, when we're in those situations where maybe we're getting less food, maybe we're having less money, maybe we're being affected by these groups that are coming into our spaces, we can't fix it, but we turn into the worst versions of ourselves and alleviate the feelings on those people, alleviate our negative feelings on those people. And I just wish that we were having more of these types of conversations openly so that we could recognize in ourselves and in our communities when we were leaning those ways before it was too late. And I feel like almost what's happening in the States with our government right now is exposing that, because there is a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment that's not tied to a particular difficult time, like a real difficult time that's impacting us. It's not like Celeste Ng's story where there's a huge economic downturn that could be tied to immigrants. There is an economic downturn that's getting tied very directly to the government. There's no economic downturn that can be tied to a particular group. And so people trying to use those narratives is coming off as false. And there's a lot of people looking around like wondering what's really happening. It's going to be interesting what kind of comes out of all this and what this conversation is going to look like in 3 years, because just from Celeste Ng's book to today, it's a completely different landscape. So hopefully we learn some lessons and hopefully it gets better. I gave The Betrayal of Anne Frank 3 pandas only because of what was inevitable. I really loved the history. I got a lot out of this story from that, of the different players and what situations look like. However, there was no way that this was ever going to be solved in this book. There's no way this was going to be solved this many years later. I mean, maybe a 0.0001% chance, but realistically, how are you going to have solved something this many years later? So many people are gone, and there was no evidence gathering and preserving at that time the way you would have today. So there's just so much compromised. And I feel like if we were going to find the person, we would have by now. There have been several books that have tried to like give out theories of who it was. And that's just basically what this was. It was a trying to guess a whodunit. And by the end, it's like, so we think most likely based off all these things that it's probably this person. I think I would have been okay with a story around Anne Frank without this need to, you know, do a bum, bum, bum. It might most likely was like, if you can't say something with certainty, it just feels like it was a method to move the story forward that didn't feel particularly compelling. Moral of the story is, when you think that some things are not related, you are possibly wrong. And so you should let yourself be open to just kind of seeing what happens. And you'll realize that they are related. While the individual books were not the highest pandas that I could have had, I still loved reading them together. Like the mental place that it took me to and the thoughts that I was having around kind of these real world circumstances and how everything is so tied together and what that means with what we're going through today was a lot of things that I feel like benefited me. It benefited me to realize that I don't know everything about everything. It's impossible. Like, you think that you know what these countries are like, or you think that you know like the circumstances because you've read X amount of things or you've heard X amount of things. There's so many parts of a picture that you have no idea about. I did not know anything about the Hong Kong relationship up until the British relinquished their control there. Like I had no idea about the state of Amsterdam and what kind of environment that story took place in. There are just so many moments where I realize there's so much I don't know, and there's so much still that I want to know. And it just keeps feeding, everything I read just keeps feeding this want to know more, because I learned something else and I'm like, oh, well, now I gotta go find out the history of Hong Kong. Now I've got to, does it happen to you? I feel like it happens to the best of us, guys. However, within finding out more, I want to get away from some of these same stories. There was a part, for instance, in the Anne Frank book where they were talking about how when the Jews came back to the Netherlands from the camps, the government wasn't giving them any assistance because they said that would be singling them out, and they just learned their lesson that you shouldn't single out the Jews. And I'm like, you helped anyways. Like, again, there's just so many things I don't understand. There's so many different stories I'm not being exposed to. I need to find them, guys. That's the end of it. I made it before all my light is gone. The sun is like, it's about to leave me. I hope that the light in this video is not absolutely insane, but we got it done, and we're going to get this out in the world, and then we're going to have the book haul. The next video is the book haul from an Asian American bookstore in, I think she's Filipino, in Jacksonville. And it's a feminist bookstore, and it's such a cute little bookstore. It's adorable. It's this little house, and she does so many events. She does like Stitch and Bitch, where they knit and gossip and they do yoga, and she has so many events. I think she has a cookbook group that brings their platters to like a beer place. I don't know. I love that store, and I'm so excited that I get to do it this month. And I'm going to see you guys in the next one. And I hope you really enjoyed this one. And I've got a podcast coming up, and you're going to see it. I'm going to tell you about it more another time. Book friends. Till the next time.